Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to another episode of the BeQuran Podcast. I'm Ali, and today we're tackling one of the most challenging and timeless questions in theology.
That's right. I'm Fatima. And in this episode, we're diving deep into the problem of evil. Why does suffering exist if God is all good and all-powerful? Is evil a sign of divine absence, or is there a deeper wisdom at play?
We'll explore the philosophical idea of dualism and why Islam rejects the notion of two competing divine forces, one good and one evil. Instead, the Qur'an teaches us that everything, even pain and difficulty, is under Allah's will and wisdom.
Together, we'll reflect on real-life analogies, verses from the Qur'an, and how tests and trials can actually be signs of Allah's mercy, not His neglect.
If you've ever asked, why me, or struggled with injustice in the world, this episode is for you.
Let's begin. Bismillah.
Today's deep dive unpacks a really old concept, dualism. Specifically, this belief that there are two fundamental divine powers, one source of all good and another distinct source of all evil.
Yeah, and this idea, it's got roots stretching back millennia. You see it in various forms, different cultures, Persians, Romans, Greeks, you name it.
In Arabic, there's a specific term, thanawiya, comes from thani, which just means two.
Captures it perfectly.
It really does. That core idea of duality, right at the top.
And the driving question behind dualism, the one it seems to grapple with, is this. If you believe in a single God who is purely, absolutely good, where does evil come from?
Exactly. That's the crux of it. The source material we're looking at really highlights that dualist logic. Well, it goes something like this.
Evil clearly exists, right? We see suffering, malice, we're all denying that. And if God is purely good, He couldn't possibly create evil.
It just doesn't track. So the conclusion they draw is there must be another power.
A separate God.
A separate, eternal, independent being who is the source of all the bad stuff, all the mischief, the evilness, the suffering in the universe.
So you end up with two eternal gods, one good, one evil.
Okay, so that's the dualist position. And our mission here in this deep dive is to explore how the source material confronts that problem, how it offers counterarguments.
Exactly. And the source presents a couple of really distinct ways to think about it, challenging that need for a second evil god.
So where does the source start? What's the first big challenge?
The first angle is quite profound, actually. It questions the very nature of evil itself.
Maybe evil isn't a positive thing, an entity created by someone.
Okay, so if it's not a thing, what is it?
It suggests evil might be, well, the absence of good?
The absence of good? Like nothingness?
Sort of. Think about the analogies the source uses. Darkness, for example.
Right.
Is darkness a substance, something that exists on its own, or is it just where light isn't?
Light exists, its absence is darkness.
Precisely. Light is, its lack is darkness. There isn't some darkness creator battling the light creator.
And the classic one, life and death. Death isn't a separate creation. It's fundamentally the absence of life.
All right, I follow the analogies, but how does this really tackle the problem of evil and God? Does calling suffering or cruelty an absence change the fact that it feels very real, very positive in its impact? Does that really satisfy someone facing real hardship?
That's a really important point. The source isn't trying to diminish the experience of evil.
The pain is real. The suffering is real.
The point is about its origin and metaphysical nature. If you start with the premise that God is the single, absolute source of all goodness, and that everything He created was originally based on that inherent goodness, then evil isn't something made by an opposing force.
It arises when that original goodness is missing from something, or perhaps when a creation actively rejects or blocks God's goodness.
Ah, okay.
So it's not an external enemy God, it's more like a deficiency, a state of being cut off from the source.
You could put it that way. Think about the sunlight analogy the source mentions.
The sun is pure light, right?
It doesn't contain darkness, it just shines.
Sure, but if you put something opaque in the path of the sunlight, what happens?
You get a shadow.
Exactly, a shadow, an area where the light is blocked.
That shadow, that darkness, is the absence of the sun's light in that spot.
It wasn't created by an anti-sun, so translating that, God is the source.
Of goodness, like the sun is the source of light. And people, through their choices, their actions, can effectively block that divine goodness, that
Mercy Rama, as it's called in Arabic.
and that blocking, that resulting state where goodness is absent or rejected, that's what we perceive and call evil. That's the essence of the first argument. Evil as a deficiency, a lack, an absence, not a positive creation by some rival deity.
That's it, yeah. That's a powerful way to reframe it. But you said the source offers another angle too.
It does, a second counter-argument, which takes a slightly different approach. It asks, what if God did, in some sense, directly create or allow things that we perceive as evil?
Okay, that sounds closer to the original problem.
Yeah.
If a good God allows or even creates bad things, how does that work without needing an evil counterpart?
Well, the source suggests that even if God permits or, let's say, brings about things that seem evil from our limited human view, it's always for a wise purpose.
A wise purpose?
Yes, and because of that underlying wisdom, that ultimately good purpose, the entire system remains good and just. It doesn't negate God's goodness.
How did that work?
The source gives an analogy for this too, right?
The professor.
It does. The professor crafting a multiple choice test. On that test, you have the correct answers, representing truth, goodness, whatever. But the professor also intentionally includes wrong answers, false options, misleading choices.
Okay.
Now, from one perspective, those wrong answers are falsehoods. You could even call them a kind of evil within the context of finding the truth on the test.
They lead you astray.
Exactly. And who put them there? The professor did. But why?
To test the student.
Precisely. Not out of malice. The purpose is to challenge the student, to make them use their knowledge, to discern truth from falsehood. It serves a necessary, wise function within the educational system itself.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Applying that to God and the world. The idea is, even if God allows or creates elements that seem negative or evil to us, like challenges, hardships, even temptations, they exist for a larger, ultimately good purpose within the divine system.
Like testing humanity, allowing for genuine choice between good and bad.
Exactly. Things like testing, growth, learning responsibility, accountability. The source argues that this perspective means you still only need one God. He's the source of everything, including the things that look like false answers on the cosmic tests.
But the system itself is still good.
Yes, because, crucially, God also provides the tools to navigate the test. Intellect, revelation, conscience, the capacity to choose. The existence of difficulty or wrong options isn't inherently unjust if you're equipped to deal with them, and the test itself serves a beneficial purpose.
So you don't need a second evil God to explain the hardships or the temptations. They're part of the single creator's wise design.
That's the core of the second argument. The entire system with its tests and challenges is ultimately an expression of God's wisdom and justice.
Okay, that framework, it makes a certain kind of sense for adult choices, moral tests. But what about the really tough cases? The ones the source touches on, like specific instances of suffering that seem random or undeserved. Things like birth defects or intense suffering in infants, in those we consider completely innocent. That's often the hardest part for people to reconcile with a single good God. How does the source address those?
It definitely acknowledges how deeply difficult these specific cases are, and it suggests looking at them from, well, multiple perspectives within that same framework of divine wisdom and testing.
Okay, like What?
Well, such instances can absolutely be profound tests, sometimes perhaps for the individual if they reach an age of understanding, but very often they are immense tests for the people around them.
The parents, the family, the community.
Exactly. Tests of their faith, their patience, their compassion, their reliance on God in the face of something heart-wrenching.
And the source specifically mentions the example of a suffering baby. What are the perspectives there?
Several angles are presented. Firstly, as we just said, it's undeniably a major test for the parents and the family. Their response, their patience, it's significant.
And for the baby itself, who obviously isn't making choices or being morally tested in the same way.
For the baby, the source points to teachings that promise, well, infinite compensation in the afterlife, in paradise. The suffering endured here, which was completely beyond their control or deserts, is recompensed eternally.
So immense reward in the hereafter balances the suffering in this world.
That's one key perspective, but the source also raises another quite intriguing possibility. Perhaps, and this is deep, perhaps the suffering, tragically, saved the baby from a potentially far worse outcome later in life.
Saved him how?
The idea is maybe if that child had lived a full, healthy life, they might have grown up, gone astray, committed terrible wrongs, caused great corruption, leading to severe consequences, punishment, maybe even eternal damnation. So the source suggests that God, in his infinite wisdom and mercy, for reasons only he truly knows, might have, in a way, protected them from that future spiritual ruin through the suffering they experienced as an innocent.
That's a heavy thought. A kind of difficult mercy.
It's one possibility raised to understand such cases within a framework of ultimate divine goodness. And crucially, the source highlights the baby's status. They are sinless. They aren't held accountable.
Right.
Their outcome is guaranteed positive, which is similar in result to someone considered ma'asum, possessing that special divine protection from sin, though the definition is different. The baby simply bypasses accountability altogether.
And the parents, if they endured this test?
The source stresses the immense spiritual reward for patience and acceptance. Even if their patience isn't perfect, the very act of enduring that hardship and loss can serve as an expiation, reducing the burden of their own shortcomings.
So even in these most agonizing specific examples, the source offers ways to understand them. Tests, compensation, hidden wisdom, protection, all pointing back to a single good and just God rather than needing a second evil God.
That's the aim, yes, to show how these hard cases can be understood within the monotheistic framework, countering the dualism necessity for a second God.
Okay, so if we step back again, looking at the bigger picture the source paints, how can someone genuinely see beauty in a system that clearly contains so much of what we call evil, suffering, and difficulty?
That's where the source brings in that incredibly powerful quote from Lady Zainab.
Ah, yes.
After the tragedy of Karbala.
Exactly.
After witnessing the absolute horror involving her brother Imam Hussein, enduring unimaginable loss and humiliation, someone made a cruel remark to her,
Implying this was some kind of
negative judgment from God. And her response, despite everything, she said, "I have not seen anything but beauty."
I have not seen anything but beauty. Yeah. In the face of that, how does the source interpret that?
It's interpreted as seeing beyond the immediate horrific suffering. She wasn't saying the events themselves were pleasant. Of course not. She was seeing the beauty in God's overarching plan, his system.
The system itself.
Yes, the tragedy, while devastating personally, was understood within a divine context. It massively elevated the spiritual status of Imam Hussein and his companions. It served as a crucial pivotal test for the entire community, for history itself. The underlying wisdom, the ultimate purpose, the demonstration of loyalty and sacrifice, the eventual triumph of truth. That whole divine tapestry was what she perceived as beautiful, even through tears of grief.
It reminds me of that university analogy.
The source used earlier.
It's very similar. Think about a really tough, prestigious university. Getting through it involves immense struggle, right? Hard exams, failures, stress, sleep deprivation, maybe real moments of despair for the students.
Definitely, you wouldn't call failing an exam beautiful while it's happening.
Exactly. But step back. Look at the university as a system. Its high standards, the knowledge it offers, the intellectual growth it forces, the value of the degree.
People often describe that system as beautiful.
Or excellent or valuable precisely because it's rigorous and demanding.
Right. The difficulty is part of what makes it valuable. So the parallel is looking at the divine system. Individual experiences might involve intense suffering, things that feel evil or unjust from our limited view. But if you can perceive the whole system designed by an all-wise God for ultimate justice, for testing, for growth, for elevation, for accountability, then perhaps you too can start to see the underlying beauty in that divine architecture, as Lady Zainab did.
It's a profound shift in perspective, moving from the painful element to the potentially beautiful purpose of the whole structure.
Is the idea presented?
Okay, so recapping the main points from our source material, challenging dualism. First, this idea that evil isn't really a thing created by an evil God, but rather the absence of good, like
darkness is the absence of light.
A deficiency, not a competing entity. And second, even if God allows or incorporates things that seem evil into the world, it's done for a wise, ultimately good purpose within his overall system, like testing.
Or allowing for meaningful choice.
Exactly. Like the wrong answers on the professor's test, serving a purpose within a fundamentally good educational structure.
And these perspectives, as the source presents them, offer ways to understand the existence of evil and suffering without needing to believe in two competing gods, one good and one evil. They uphold the idea of one single good and just creator.
They provide a framework.
Yes, that directly counters the core logic of dualism that says evil must come from an evil source.
So let's leave you, the listener, with this thought, drawing from what we've explored. If this source material is right, if what we perceive as evil or suffering isn't just random chaos or the work of a cosmic villain, but is potentially understood as either the absence of God's goodness or as a necessary, even challenging, part of a divine system designed for testing, for learning, for growth, and ultimately leading towards a just and beautiful outcome. How might that perspective change the way you look at the difficulties, the setbacks, the challenges you encounter in your own life?